The United States of America is preparing for war with China. I'm not exaggerating. I wish this were not true. Of course, I don't want a war. I think that would be catastrophic for the world. But there is more and more evidence showing that the US military is preparing for war. Pentagon contractors in Silicon Valley are making new weapons and technology to prepare for war on China. This was reported in 2024 by the Wall Street Journal in an article titled "Tech Bros Are Betting They Can Help Win a War with China." The article discusses plans for a potential war between the US and China over Taiwan as soon as 2027. Now, in a few minutes here, I'm going to come back to this article and analyze some of the most important information that it discloses. But first, I want to look at another report in the Wall Street Journal that was published in March 2025 that is even more disturbing because it discloses how the US military has deployed a missile system in the Philippines that could hit most of the cities in China. This is known as the Typhoon missile system, and it can fire missiles as far as 1,240 miles, which is roughly 2,000 kilometers. The Wall Street Journal published a map that shows that this missile system that the US put in the northern part of the Philippines can hit major Chinese cities like Shanghai, Hangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, even as far as Chongqing in central China. And the Wall Street Journal noted that this is the first time since the first Cold War that the US military has deployed a land-based launching system with such a long range outside of US borders. Let's not forget what happened in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Can you imagine what the response of the US government would be if China put this kind of missile system in Cuba today? Washington would claim that this would be an aggressive act of war, and they would probably threaten to attack China and wage nuclear war on China. The world came close to a nuclear war, to a nuclear apocalypse in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US portrayed the Soviet Union as a threat, not mentioning, of course, that the reason that the USSR put missiles in Cuba was because the US first put nuclear missiles in Turkey, a member of NATO, preparing for a potential nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Well, here we are today. It's obvious that we're in a new Cold War, Cold War II, the second Cold War, and the US is using multiple military bases in the Philippines to prepare for war with China. Now, I want to emphasize that in Washington, the warmongering against Beijing is bipartisan. There are both Republicans and Democrats who are pushing for war on China. And this report in the Wall Street Journal makes it clear that the US military deployed this missile system in 2024 when Biden was still the president. But now, of course, Trump is president, and both parties are preparing for war with China. This did not just begin under Trump. I want to make that clear. I don't want people to think that I'm just saying that only Trump is bad and that the Democrats are all good. No, what I'm saying is that for years, the US military has been preparing for war with China, and it is now reaching fever pitch. The situation is very, very dangerous. Now, additionally, the Trump administration is waging a brutal economic war and a trade war against China. In fact, Trump originally, in April, he threatened tariffs on countries all around the world, but then he paused those tariffs except for on China. He put 145% tariffs on China, which essentially means that trade between the US and China will end. This is part of a strategy in which the US is trying to decouple from China. I discussed Trump's very aggressive economic war against China in another video, which I will link to in the description below. But today I'm focusing more on the military threats that the US has made against China. Because yes, we're in a new Cold War. The US is waging Cold War II against China. And economic war and trade war is part of that. But at the heart of it is military threats for conventional war against China. And the Trump administration has vowed to massively expand military spending to more than $1 trillion Donald Trump himself personally promised this.
We have great things happening with our military. We also essentially approved a budget, which is in the facility, you'll like to hear this, of $1 trillion, $1 trillion. And nobody's seen anything like it. We have to build our military, and we're very cost conscious, but the military is something that we have to build, and we have to be strong because you got a lot of bad forces out there now. So we're going to be approving a budget, and I'm proud to say, actually, the biggest one we've ever done for the military.
Now, this is deeply ironic because Trump has claimed that he wants to cut the massive U.S. government deficits, and he appointed the world's richest billionaire oligarch, Elon Musk, to oversee the DOGE, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. And Elon Musk claimed that he was going to bring down U.S. government spending. And the Trump administration is trying to gut social spending. They plan on cutting support for low-income Americans in the form of food stamps, which they want to cut, and in the form of Medicaid, which is medical assistance, healthcare for poor people. They plan on cutting that, while at the same time massively expanding the military budget. And why? Because they want to prepare for war on China. And although in Washington there is a bipartisan war drive targeting China from both the Republicans and the Democrats, I have to emphasize how dangerous this moment is with the Donald Trump administration. Trump has selected a series of neoconservative war hawks to run his foreign policy, and they are extreme anti-China fanatics who are foaming at the mouth for conflict. And this is especially the case with the current U.S. Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, who is a former Fox News host, and Trump watched him all the time on Fox News, and he loved him. So he said, I'm going to name this guy as the head of the Pentagon.
You need a military-industrial complex. There's no doubt about it. We should only be focused on readiness and meritocracy and lethality.
And making our military, once again, the most lethal, badass fighting force on the planet.
And Pete Hegseth is simply a fundamentalist. And I'm not using that term as an insult. That is an objective term. He published a book in 2020 titled American Crusade, in which he referred to himself proudly as a crusader. He said that the U.S. is waging a holy war against China. I'm not joking. On the first page of his book, he said the U.S. is in a holy war against China and also against the international left and against Islam. And in this book, he called for overthrowing the Chinese government and the Communist Party of China. And he said that for hundreds of years, China will be licking its wounds after the U.S. overthrows its government. This is the guy whom Trump picked to run the U.S. military, an extreme hawk. And the Washington Post published a very disturbing report this March in which the newspaper got its hands on an internal memo in the Defense Department in which Pete Hegseth told the U.S. military to prepare for war with China. And he emphasized that countering China is by far the number one goal of the Pentagon. No other issue comes even remotely close. And what's also quite revealing about this memo is that certain sections of the memo were verbatim copies of a previous report that was published by the right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation, which is based in Washington, D.C. The Heritage Foundation is funded by big U.S. corporations and billionaires and millionaires who use it to lobby the U.S. government for new policies that benefit U.S. corporate interests and conservative cultural groups. And this group became well known because the Heritage Foundation is behind Project 2025, which created a huge blueprint with tons of different policies that they wanted Trump to implement when he was running for president in 2024. The Heritage Foundation played a key role back in the 1980s in the Ronald Reagan administration. And here today, the same organization is helping to create policy for the Trump administration. The Washington Post obtained a leaked copy of this memo that is being circulated inside the Defense Department, which was personally signed by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Several passages from this memo were completely lifted verbatim from the Heritage Foundation report, and one of the authors of this Heritage Foundation report that is calling for preparing for war with China, one of the co-authors is now a top official in the Pentagon. The memo makes it clear that the top goal of the Pentagon, the number one priority, is preparing for war with China over Taiwan. And that's why the Trump administration has essentially told Europe to focus on its own security issues. As the Washington Post put it, the memo outlines, quote, President Donald Trump's vision to prepare for and win a potential war against Beijing, end quote. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I want to be fair. This is bipartisan in Washington, the warmongering against China. Both Republicans and Democrats have been pushing for war on China for years. And this Washington Post report points out that both the Trump administration, the first one, and the Biden administration were demonizing China and portraying it as the so-called greatest threat to the U.S. and preparing for conflict, as they say, in the Pacific region, which is, a euphemism for war. However, again, I want to emphasize that Pete Hegseth is a fundamentalist. He's a self-declared crusader who said that the U.S. is waging a holy war on China. Those are his words. And as the Washington Post put it in this article, quote, Hegseth's guidance is extraordinary in its description of the potential invasion of Taiwan as the exclusive animating scenario that must be prioritized over other potential dangers, reorienting the vast U.S. military architecture toward the Indo-Pacific region, end quote. So again, this is why the Trump administration is trying to broker a peace agreement in Ukraine. It's not because the Trump administration wants peace. It's because they're preparing for war on China, and they don't see Russia as a threat. They see China as a threat. This is why Trump actually proposed, he said he wants the U.S. to ally with Russia against China. He told Tucker Carlson that his goal is to try to divide Russia and China.
Is you never want Russia and China uniting. We united them. It's a shame. The stupidity of what they've done. Well, I'm going to have to ununite them, and I think I can do that too. I have to ununite them.
This is why in this internal memo that is being circulated by the Pentagon, the U.S. military has said that it is willing to assume risk in other theaters, like in Europe. They're saying that, fine, Europe is not our concern anymore. Europe can deal with its own security issues because the U.S. is now obsessively committed to one goal. The Defense Department memo stated very clearly, quote, China is the department's sole pacing threat, end quote. Now, pacing threat is a special term that is used by the U.S. military. The Pentagon is notorious for having a lot of special jargon that it uses. And the U.S. military's Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs published an article, a scholarly article in 2024 that explains more about this idea of the pacing threat. This article noted that in 2020, during Trump's first term, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper referred to China as the pacing threat for the Defense Department, and he tasked the U.S. military to, quote, make China the pacing threat in all of our schools, programs, and training, end quote. Then in 2021, the U.S. military's interim national security strategy elevated China as the preeminent threat to the national security interests of the United States. And then in 2022, the DOD's National Defense Strategy designated the People's Republic of China as our most consequential strategic competitor. And the Pentagon argued that China represents the only country that can pose a systemic challenge to the United States economically, technologically, politically, and militarily. The U.S. empire sees China as a threat because it's the only country powerful enough to challenge the global hegemony of the U.S. empire. Ever since 1991, at the end of the first Cold War, when the Soviet Union was overthrown, the United States tried to impose its unipolar hegemony on the world. This was known as the unipolar moment. The US military tried to impose what are referred to as full spectrum dominance. In the infamous Wolfowitz Doctrine, the Pentagon said that the US military should have control over every region of the world. China is the only country powerful enough to challenge US global hegemony, not only militarily. Of course, Russia is also a major military power, but China is much more powerful economically. China has had the world's largest economy when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity since 2016. And China continues to grow at a very healthy pace. Moreover, China is now the world's manufacturing superpower, representing roughly 1/3 of global manufacturing production, which is nearly 3 times the manufacturing output of the United States. And China is challenging the technological monopolies that the US has, that US big tech corporations in Silicon Valley have in areas like artificial intelligence. This is why the US government has been trying to ban Chinese companies like Huawei and DeepSeek and TikTok. And it's why the US government, not only under Trump, but also under Joe Biden, put tariffs and sanctions and export restrictions on China, trying to prevent China from getting access to advanced semiconductors, chips that it needs to train its AI models. And this is why the US Department of Defense has stated very clearly in its internal documents that China is the #1 so-called threat. And this is why this internal Pentagon memo signed by Defense Secretary Hegseth has said that the Pentagon is committed above all to trying to prevent the Chinese mainland from reintegrating with Taiwan. The US goal is to try to use Taiwan as a military outpost to weaken China. And this goes back to the original strategy during the first Cold War, when the US military not only had a large military base on Taiwan, but the US actually had nuclear weapons stored in Taiwan. In fact, during the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis in 1958, the US military wanted to nuke China over Taiwan. This was disclosed in 2021 by the famous whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers. He revealed that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the leaders of the US military, were pushing to use nuclear weapons against China in 1958, but it was actually the US President Eisenhower who was against the idea because he didn't want a nuclear war. Now, of course, Eisenhower was not a dove by any stretch of the imagination. He said that the US should use conventional missiles and bombs to attack China instead of nuclear missiles. But the point I'm getting at is that during the first Cold War, the US had a large military base in Taiwan with nuclear weapons, and they came very close to using those nuclear weapons against the Chinese mainland. And what the US would love to do today is to reopen that military base and put more nuclear weapons. In fact, the US military already has troops in Taiwan. This has been acknowledged. In fact, the Biden administration doubled the number of US troops in Taiwan. Moreover, the United States has sold Taiwan billions of dollars of weapons and military technology over years. In 2023, the BBC published an article that said very clearly, quote, "The US is quietly arming Taiwan to the teeth," end quote. And what Washington has essentially been doing is eroding the very foundations of the formal diplomatic relations between the US and China. In 1972, when the US President Richard Nixon visited China, they signed the first communiqué, the Shanghai Communiqué, in which the US acknowledged the one China policy, that there's only one China, that Taiwan is part of China. And then in 1979, when the US and China formally established diplomatic relations, the US once again acknowledged the one China policy, and in the third communiqué, signed in 1982, the US promised that over time, it would stop selling weapons to Taiwan. Well, here we are 40 years later, and not only does the US continue to sell weapons to Taiwan, it's actually selling more weapons over time, not fewer weapons. So the United States has clearly been violating the spirit of the one China policy, even though technically, formally on paper, the US government recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. This is written in international law. At the United Nations, there is only one China, the People's Republic of China, and the United Nations recognizes Taiwan as part of China. And not just the UN, even US-dominated bodies like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in which the US has veto power. The IMF, if you go to their website, they refer to Taiwan as Taiwan Province of China. According to international law, even according to the US government, technically on paper, they recognize that Taiwan is part of China. There is only one China. That is the one China policy. The US has been strongly supporting separatists in Taiwan who are pushing for formal independence from China, including the current leader of Taiwan, who's very pro-US, Lai Ching-te, who is pushing right up on the limits of declaring independence from China, which would cause a war, and the US government has been cheering him on, both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and giving him billions of dollars of weapons.
We have to be present. In the Indo-Pacific, they're trying to drive us out. We have a strong relationship. We are a Pacific nation. We are. And so we have relationships in the Pacific, and we're not going to abandon those. Japan, South Korea. You mentioned Taiwan. We have a long-standing position on Taiwan that we're not going to abandon. And that is, we are against any forced, compelled, coercive change in the status of Taiwan. That's been our position since the late 1970s, and that continues to be our position, and that's not going to change. But we have to have military capabilities that allow us to respond to the threat that China is posing.
And by the way, although they claim to be democratic in scare quotes, what they're now planning on doing, the Taiwanese leadership, is they're threatening to bring back the military tribunals from back during the original Cold War, because during the first Cold War, Taiwan did not have a liberal democracy. Taiwan was run by a military dictatorship, by the Kuomintang, the KMT, and now the so-called democratic authorities in Taiwan are threatening to bring back military tribunals so they can throw their political opposition in prison and accuse them of being spies for mainland China, or for being too friendly with the Chinese mainland, which for them will be a crime because, again, they and their US sponsors are preparing for war with China, which is why they need to resort to these very extreme authoritarian tactics. And by the way, they can talk about democracy in scare quotes all they want. You know, when they say democracy, they mean billionaires and millionaires can buy elections and corporations are people, you know, as the US Supreme Court ruled. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is that they talk about democracy, but in reality, the vast majority of people in Taiwan do not want separatism, do not want independence. Polls show that over 80% of people in Taiwan want the status quo, not independence. A poll found that in 2023, only 3.8% of people wanted Taiwan's immediate independence. And over decades, polling has shown that there has never been more than 7.8% of the population of Taiwan who want immediate independence from China. So US government propaganda and corporate media talking points, they claim that they have to support democracy in Taiwan. In order to support democracy, supposedly they have to support independence. But the vast majority of the population doesn't want independence. Only a small percentage of pro-US elites, who often are funded by US think tanks and US corporations, US foundations, only they want independence. They don't represent the majority. And yet the US is threatening war with China over Taiwan because, again, the US wants to turn Taiwan into a big military base that it can use to try to weaken China. And by the way, there's another important reason, which is that Taiwan is home to one of the world's most important companies, which is called TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. They produce the majority of the world's most advanced chips, which are needed for advanced technologies, especially for training artificial intelligence, AI. And Trump has been trying to force this Taiwanese company to move its factories over to the US to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in plants in the US to make those chips domestically because Trump knows that the US is preparing for war on China and that all of those factories and all of the capital equipment could be destroyed in this war that the US military is planning for. So essentially, Trump wants to turn TSMC into a US company. So the situation is very, very dangerous. The US is playing with fire because from China's perspective, this is the reddest of all red lines. It cannot be crossed. According to international law, Taiwan is part of China. The US is trying to break off part of China so it can make a big military base with nuclear weapons. China will never tolerate this in a million years. And this is why China has been doing regular, large-scale military exercises around Taiwan. The US has been pushing this. This is so dangerous. And Hegseth is making it very clear that the US military is preparing for war with China. In March, he took a trip to Asia, to Japan and the Philippines, and he held press conferences in which he said that the US is preparing for war, basically. As the Wall Street Journal put it, Hegseth told US Asian allies, "We're with you against China." When Hegseth was visiting Japan, which, by the way, colonized China and much of Asia during World War II, the 1930s and the 1940s, when Hegseth was visiting Japan, he announced that the US military is deepening its cooperation, its collaboration with Japan, and he announced the creation of joint, quote, war-fighting headquarters, end quote, to prepare for war against China. Listen to this clip here.
To conduct activities that will strengthen our bilateral bonds and deepen our operational cooperation. This also means reorganizing U.S. forces Japan into a warfighting headquarters.
That's basically as clear as it's ever going to get. I mean, other than if the U.S. publicly declares war on China. But here you have the defense secretary publicly say that they're reorganizing U.S. forces in Japan into a war-fighting headquarters to prepare for war. And what's so crazy about the Trump administration's rhetoric is it's completely Orwellian. Listen to this quote here in which Hegseth claims that they want peace, but in order to have peace, they have to prepare for war, and they want to maximize their lethality.
Those who long for peace must prepare for war. We must be prepared. We look forward to working closely together as we improve our warfighting capabilities, our lethality, and our readiness.
The main slogan that the Trump administration is constantly repeating is that they want so-called peace through strength, which is another very Orwellian slogan.
As you know, President Trump has said America will reestablish peace through strength.
Hegseth said the Trump administration has three main goals for the military:
reviving the warrior ethos, rebuilding our military, and restoring deterrence. Those are the three pillars of what President Trump's Pentagon is trying to do to make sure we're prepared.
Now, in pretty much every war in human history, the aggressor always claims to be acting in self-defense. I mean, even Adolf Hitler absurdly claimed that supposedly he was acting in the defense of Germany or whatever nonsense he was saying. And of course, the US military, which has been at war nonstop for centuries, has also always claimed that it's acting in self-defense for human rights or whatever. And this is no exception here. In his remarks in Japan, Hegseth claimed that the US and Japan are working together to fight against communist Chinese aggression. Now, keep in mind that whenever he talks about China, he always says communist China. This is, the Cold War rhetoric that we're back to.
America and Japan stand firmly together in the face of aggressive and coercive actions by the communist Chinese.
Now, I really need to fact check the U.S. Defense Secretary there because it's so ridiculous hearing the head of the U.S. military claim that China is the aggressive one. China has not fought a war since 1979. That was the last war that China fought, 1979. Whereas the U.S. military has engaged in literally hundreds of military interventions just in the past few decades. According to official U.S. government data from the Congressional Research Service, the U.S. military launched 251 foreign interventions from 1991 until 2022, and 469 military interventions abroad from 1798 until 2022. The US military has intervened in the majority of all of the countries on Earth. And yet we're supposed to believe that China is supposedly the aggressive one, while the US military is surrounding China with missile systems that can hit the majority of China's cities. I mean, it's completely Orwellian. We're living in a topsy-turvy world. We're living in opposite land. But the US Defense Secretary repeated the same Orwellian rhetoric when he visited the Philippines in March on this tour of Asia. And Pete Hegseth said that the United States is working to fight against communist China's aggression.
It reflects the strength, as I said, of our ironclad alliance, particularly in the face of communist China's aggression in the region.
But in this press conference in the Philippines, Pete Hegseth mentioned the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Samuel Paparo, and he said that this U.S. Admiral Paparo is making, quote, real war plans, end quote. And then he said that the U.S. military is creating strategic dilemmas for the communist Chinese. Listen here.
You mentioned the Seventh Fleet. It's not my job to determine where the Seventh Fleet goes. I defer to Admiral Paparo and his war plans, real war plans. Admiral Paparo understands the situation, understands the geographic significance, understands the urgency, and is prepared to work with those in the region to ensure we are leaning forward in our posture, not waiting for events to develop, not retrograding to places further from the front, but deploying capabilities forward, posturing and creating dynamics and strategic dilemmas for the communist Chinese.
Now, the Philippines has become the main U.S. proxy that Washington is trying to use to push for war on China. And the U.S. military has gotten access to several new military bases in the Philippines. This goes back to the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration is continuing this policy of militarizing the Philippines to prepare for war on China. The current government of the Philippines is led by a very pro-U.S. leader named Ferdinand Marcos Jr., known as Bongbong Marcos. He's the son of the former longtime dictator of the Philippines, who during the First Cold War was a loyal U.S. puppet, and he governed the Philippines with an iron fist. He was a brutal dictator. And the Marcos family is also notorious for being extremely corrupt. During this US-backed right-wing dictatorship in the Philippines, the Marcos family stole billions of dollars of wealth from the people of the Philippines, which is a very poor country. And they never faced any consequences, any repercussions. And now the corrupt dictator's son is back in power, and he has once again turned the Philippines into a loyal U.S. proxy in the new Cold War. And in this press conference with Hegseth, the Defense Secretary of the Philippines said that the U.S. and the Philippines are united against the so-called threat of the Communist Party of China.
We are facing a common threat, which now is the overreach of the Communist Party of China.
So it's obvious that the reason that the U.S. Defense Secretary took this trip to Asia in March, visiting the Philippines and Japan, is that this is part of the Trump administration's strategy, is they're telling Asian allies that the U.S. military is committed to working with them to prepare for war on China, while the U.S. military is withdrawing from Europe. They're making it clear that Europe is not their priority. Russia, they're not concerned about Russia. That's why they want to end the war in Ukraine. Their real priority is war with China. So, in the last several minutes here, I've been talking about the U.S. military's preparations for war with China, and why the US empire sees China as a threat and wants war with China. I want to conclude this analysis today talking about what's going on in Silicon Valley with US tech corporations that are contractors for the Pentagon and that are making weapons to prepare for war with China. I'm going to go back to this article that I briefly addressed earlier, which was published in the Wall Street Journal in August of 2024, which is titled, "Tech Bros Are Betting They Can Help Win a War with China." This report is largely focused on a billionaire oligarch in Silicon Valley named Palmer Luckey, who was previously an executive at Facebook. He's a major Trump donor and a donor to the Republican Party. And he left Facebook and he created his own weapons corporation, which is called Anduril Industries, which is named after a magical sword from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. And what are they committed to? They are committed to creating state-of-the-art sci-fi style weapons, autonomous weapons in particular, like drones and uncrewed submarines, remote control submarines. And why do they want to do this? Because they're preparing for war on China. As the Wall Street Journal stated in this report, quote, "These weapons," Luckey argues, "are needed for a potential conflict with China, which the Pentagon 2 years ago, that is in 2022, announced is the greatest danger to U.S. security. The U.S. military," Luckey and others say, "needs large numbers of cheaper and more intelligent systems that can be effective over long stretches of ocean and against a manufacturing and technological power like China. Anduril is so focused on a conflict with Beijing," Luckey says, "that many teams inside the company are building only weapons that can be completed by 2027, end quote. And that's when they expect there could be a war against China over Taiwan. Then the Wall Street Journal added that the name of this company, Anduril, in the Lord of the Rings universe means Flame of the West. So, okay. And Luckey, this billionaire from Silicon Valley, he said in this article, quote, "We keep our eyes on the prize, which is great power conflict in the Pacific," end quote. So that's a euphemism for saying war on China. Now, this billionaire Palmer Luckey is notorious for being very eccentric. He always wears Hawaiian shirts and shorts instead of suits. This article also revealed a very disturbing fact, which is that this Silicon Valley billionaire has dreamed of creating a weapons company since he was 7 years old. I mean, that's sociopathic. But what's also even crazier is that he was inspired by the Japanese anime Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is like a card anime. I mean, we are ruled by sociopathic nerds, from this guy to Elon Musk, and they name everything after the Lord of the Rings. Also, Palantir was named after the Lord of the Rings, which is another major Pentagon contractor. And this guy, this Silicon Valley billionaire, Palmer Luckey, he said in this article, quote, "I someday would love to fly on my own fighter jet shaped like a dragon that I have designed, wearing a virtual reality headset to pilot." What? This guy is so crazy. And the Wall Street Journal added that he's such a huge fan of Yu-Gi-Oh! That he frequently quotes the fictional villain from Yu-Gi-Oh!, Seto Kaiba, who said, "You said technology has limits. Wrong. When you're as brilliant as Seto Kaiba." What? But as funny as it is to laugh at these sociopathic cartoon villains in Silicon Valley, these are the people who are running the US government, especially now with, Elon Musk, who's so powerful in the Trump administration. This company in Silicon Valley has been given large contracts by the Pentagon to create rocket motors for the US military. This Wall Street Journal article added that this company, Anduril, has been given contracts to create spy towers on the US border with Mexico. It now has 300 spy towers built that are spying on immigrants crossing over from Mexico. And I mentioned Palantir, which is another major contractor with the US military. Well, Palantir is working with Anduril. They joined forces, the FT reported, to bid together for Pentagon contracts as part of a cartel. And by the way, I should mention that both of these companies that are run by these insane far-right pro-Trump people in Silicon Valley, these billionaires, they're both named after the Lord of the Rings. And they're both backed by the far-right billionaire oligarch Peter Thiel, who was the political mentor of the current US Vice President, J.D. Vance. Vance worked for Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel was his boss, the boss of the vice president. And Peter Thiel was the founder of Palantir, and Peter Thiel's venture capital fund, which is called Founders Fund, invested in Palmer Luckey's company, Anduril. So all of these guys are friends with each other. They all have very similar worldviews. They openly say that they're against democracy. They are far-right authoritarians. They love Donald Trump. They have worked personally with the US Vice President, J.D. Vance. They're friends with him. And they're all working together to prepare for war on China. And I need to emphasize that US preparations for war on China are big business in the United States. There are a lot of capitalists who are making a lot of money. And when I talk about the military-industrial complex, we need to understand how the military-industrial complex has evolved in recent decades in the US. The Wall Street Journal in this article noted that there's been a massive flow of venture capital funding into military technology companies. There is more and more private sector money available for research and development. It's now more than federal government spending on research and development for military technology. And this article describes a new cohort of defense startups using private capital to develop technology for the Pentagon. So the military-industrial complex is becoming even more and more privatized. The Wall Street Journal notes that the amount of private capital flowing into the venture-backed military tech industry has ballooned, with investors spending at least 70% more on the sector each of the past 3 years than any prior year. And this is as of 2024. From 2021 to 2024, venture capitalists invested a total of $130 billion in military tech startups. The Pentagon spends around $90 billion on R&D annually. So this is the brave new world that we're in, where the US government is obviously an oligarchy. Donald Trump has made that clear. It didn't start under Trump, but he made it as clear as day by appointing the world's richest billionaire oligarch Elon Musk as a top official in his administration, and by inviting the most powerful billionaire oligarchs from Silicon Valley big tech corporations to sit with his cabinet members at Trump's inauguration, including Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Tim Cook, and others. And now many of these billionaire oligarchs in Silicon Valley, people like Peter Thiel, they're investing a lot of money in private for-profit military contractors that are creating new advanced weapon systems so they can use artificial intelligence for war with China. This is what all of this is leading toward, because they're trying to save the US empire. That's the goal, is they can see that China is the only country powerful enough to challenge the global dominance, the global hegemony of the US empire. And they think that by waging a war on China, if they win, they can save the US empire, which is clearly in decline. Everyone around the world can see the massive decline of US hegemony. So this is why they're desperate. They're increasingly desperate. This is their last ditch effort, a war on China. I don't say that lightly. I am very sad about this. I think this is tragic. It's crazy. It's insane. I think that we should do everything we can to try to prevent a war, especially given how dangerous it could be, given that the US and China are both nuclear powers. I think that the most important thing that any of us can do in our lifetimes is to try to stop this insane war drive from happening, to push for peace. But unfortunately, I'm being realistic. I'm looking at the facts and the evidence as they exist. I'm not letting my own view of the situation try to cloud my judgment. And if you analyze the situation, it's very dangerous. And there is more and more evidence growing that shows that the US military is very serious about its preparations for war on China. It's not just rhetoric. It's not just propaganda in the media. It's actually happening. And on that note, I'm going to conclude here. If you want to get more information about this very dangerous war drive, you should subscribe here to our work at Geopolitical Economy Report. Please subscribe. Please share this. I'm Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.